If you've made the decision to watch this series, then odds are good that you're probably somewhere around two-thirds of the way complete with your MCSA certification. And so my guess is that, well, you're probably ready to get started on that final exam to actually get that MCSA cert. We can talk now honestly because, well, there are a lot of IT professionals that just haven't ever made it this far. And it makes you wonder that whether certification really does separate the real IT pros from the ones that are just calling it in every day. It takes a lot of time, effort, studying, after hours work, a lot of time away from family and friends in order to get that certification. And so making it this far and getting to this point in your career path is definitely something worth noticing. Hooray to you, and hooray to everybody out there that has taken the effort to prove that you know what you're talking about as it relates to Microsoft technologies. My name is Greg Shields, and I've been working for CPT Nuggets now for, gosh, almost 10 years. And during that period of time, I've had an opportunity to put together a lot of video series and help a lot of people along their certification and training path. And that is no different here with this series, with the 70-412 exam. We are going to, hopefully with this series, help you get to the point where you can complete your MCSA certification and perhaps even get you started down the path of a fully fledged MCSE certification as well. Now, this exam, or this series, is the 70-412 content with also the new updates that relate to Windows Server 2012 R2. And so you'll find in this series that we'll be talking about some of the stuff that perhaps was in a previous series, not only previous series from CPT Nuggets, but previous series and previous work that you've been dealing with the 412 exam. But I'm going to include, where possible, everything that has to do with Windows Server 2012 R2. In fact, all the virtual machines that we'll be working with here are R2 VMs. Everything you see is going to be based on an R2 operating system. So we've got some things, though, before we get into actually, the topics, the objective domains that make up this exam. And those are just a quick review of all the reasons why we're here. I don't want to spend too much time talking about Microsoft certification because, as I said, you're kind of two-thirds of the way through the first step of the process, which is MCSA. So telling you what exams are out there is probably a little overkill for where you are at in this entire career-wise process. What I do want to do is just talk a little bit about the intended audience and some notes, and then more specifically, the outline of the series that I've put together for you. Now, when Microsoft releases these exams, their goal is to help you assert that you absolutely know what you're talking about. And as the exam process has kind of evolved over the years from its earliest days and the early versions of the MCSE cert, the process by which to test you against that knowledge has evolved as well. And so as a consequence, you may find that this exam is a little odd in the way that it just throws a bunch of seemingly miscellaneous topics at you and forces you to learn a whole very broad spectrum of potential things in order to pass the exam. It's my goal to try to take what Microsoft wants you to learn, slice it, dice it, perhaps reorder it in certain places so it makes more sense, and hopefully try to turn this into a bit of a storyline, a better narrative to help you truly appreciate the technologies we're going to talk about. And so if you look on Microsoft's website at the different exam objectives and learning materials that are out there, you're going to find that what you see on Microsoft's website is a little bit different than what you're going to find here in the series outline. And by different, I mean that it's in a different order. When you look at Microsoft's objectives, they seem to be in a completely random order because they're trying to align the topics to what they refer to as the objective domains. And so what I've done is taken that order and brought it back into a more sane sort of order in order to provide a better way to help you understand these topics. And we'll talk about what those are, what that order is here in just a minute. And then also, we learn by doing. And actually going through the steps that I'm going to be walking you through throughout the next 22 or so nuggets, being able to do them yourself is definitely going to be helpful to just cement this, to crystallize this information into your head prior to taking that exam. And so I want to give you a little bit of just help in putting together the network that you're going to need to put together if you plan on doing this at home. Now, I will say that in order to do all the things that we have to do here, there are some ridiculous number of virtual machines that you'll have to create. And so if you can afford it, it is absolutely worth the cost to go out and pick yourself up a version of perhaps VMware Workstation. Out of all the different solutions that are out there for doing virtualization, I have found in my experience over the years that VMware Workstation, for just you and I sitting here trying to demonstrate these things, perhaps at home or on a laptop, it just has the kind of the easiest approach or the easiest solution for getting us to where we need to go. And I think it's 99 or 199 bucks these days, and it's absolutely an investment worth making if you haven't already. You can assume that for this series that everything that we're going to be dealing with is Windows Server 2012 that's sitting on the inside a VMware Workstation, I think version 10 dot something virtual machine. As I said, you at this point are probably about 2/3 of the way through your certification process. So congratulations, you have checked off 7410 and 7411. And we are now sitting here at the last of the 3 exams that make up the MCSA in Windows Server 2012. And that's an awesome accomplishment. And my kudos to you for making it this far, because these exams aren't, you're learning a lot of really core content. And between you and me, the content that makes up the MCSA here today is roughly equivalent in technical difficulty and depth to what the old MCSE used to be back a few years ago. And so even though it's still called the MCSA, the kinds of stuff that you're being told that you have to know are very MCSE oriented based on the old requirements. So it's arguably a much harder MCSA than it was in years gone past. Now, obviously, to tease you towards future certification, because the MCSA is one of the early certifications in the whole string of them. Once you get your MCSA, these 3 can then give you the starting point for getting one of the variety of MCSEs that are out there. The Microsoft Certified Systems Expert, or what used to be the engineer, is now kind of refactored into a variety of different, what I like to call flavors. It used to be you got an MCSE and that was it. These days you get an MCSE and server, and desktop, and private cloud, SQL Server, and a variety of other Microsoft technologies. So they're kind of technology oriented as opposed to being just one big MCSE for everything like that what they were back in days before the MCITP. Which MCSE you end up acquiring after your MCSA, it kind of depends on what path you want to take in your IT knowledge and where you want to see yourself as an administrator or engineer in your organization. If you plan on working with servers, the MCSE server infrastructure is a great path. These days working with desktops is also just a fantastic approach for people that are looking to be senior level people in the world today. The desktop infrastructure is arguably a little more oriented towards certain system center technologies than even the server infrastructure. You want to be a config manager person, well, you're going to find yourself being more of a desktop infrastructure person than a server infrastructure person there. To be perfectly honest, and this is just my own personal feeling, I resonate with the desktop IT pros out there because that's where I cut my teeth, was in desktop administration. And it holds a special place in my heart. But at the end of the day, if you end up wanting to get that MCSE, there's a whole lot of options there for you to get the right MCSE for whatever it is, whatever role that you want to play in your greater infrastructure. Now, the intended audience for the 70-412 really hasn't evolved that much from the other exams. This is one of 3 exams that test your skills and knowledge necessary to administer a Windows Server 2012 and R2 infrastructure in an enterprise environment. And really, again, you are just certifying or validating your ability to perform, in this case, what Microsoft refers to as the advanced configuration tasks. You will find in the MCSE curriculum that the configuration word kind of gets deprioritized towards more of the design and other higher order type activities. But a lot of the things we'll be talking about here and the questions that you will see on those exams have very specifically to do with configuring the items that we're talking about. It is for that reason, and because we have so much content to talk about, you'll find that there are going to be some more design type things that I won't talk about here in this series because I want to focus you in on specifically the configuration tasks. So if you find in a couple of these nuggets upcoming that it feels like Greg maybe missed a couple couple of things. Recognize that my goal with this series is singular in that this series is designed to get you passed with that exam. There are other series that I put together for CBT Nuggets where the priority is helping you become a better administrator, but in this one, we're talking about getting you a passing score. And for that reason, you'll find that some of the topics maybe will dance around over some priorities because I want to focus you in on the specific objectives that the exam tests against. Passing this exam along with the other two confirms that you have the skills and knowledge to be truly certified as an MCSA or an MCSA, and also to get that little hat tip from me, because you know what? Being certified is not an easy task, but there are rewards and benefits that you get from certification, even if you don't necessarily see them right out the gate. Just the ability to call yourself an MCSA these days is something that is becoming even more exciting because the number of people actually going through the effort seems to be getting smaller and smaller. You just automatically make yourself a much more valuable IT pro by going through the effort to prove that you know what you know. Microsoft exams have kind of evolved also over the years, just like the certifications have. This series of exams, I pulled off just a couple of quotes from Microsoft's website. You find that they kind of want to not give you too much information about the exam process, so you kind of got to dig deeply to find things. I've copied these directly off of Microsoft's website just to give you some idea on scoring, but you're aware of a lot of these because you've done some of these exams before. There is no penalty for guessing. If you choose an incorrect answer, you're not going to get a point for that item. In some cases, there are what I call multi-choice questions. And these are the bane of every test taker's existence because they're probably arguably the least fair of all the questions that are out there. In questions where you must choose multiple correct answers, you have to choose all of the correct answers in order to earn a point for that item. So definitely pay attention when you see those multi-choice questions. I hate them, you hate them, but the people who write these tests, they absolutely love them. Now, occasionally you may get a question too on the exam that just feels completely out of left field. Some of the questions that are on these exams are actually kind of they're on a trial basis, and in fact may not be included in the calculation of your score. So if you really get hung up on a question, don't sweat it because it may be possible that this is a question that's not calculated in your score. I would not do this too many times because the incidence of these questions is relatively low, but that's just one of the things that Microsoft releases on their website about questions that may be on there. There is no official designation of how many questions are on the exam. I have read on public websites that the number of questions on this exam is somewhere in the order of 60-ish questions, but I can't say that with any kind of definitive answer because Microsoft doesn't publish the number of questions that actually exists. There are a variety of question types as well. You've seen all of these. Again, those awful multi-choice questions, the hot area and active screen, drag and drop and build list and reorder questions. These are also a really challenging one here because you have to take the right items from the available ones and put them in the box and then order them correctly to get the points. As usual, this, like all Microsoft exams, are administered through Prometric. There's the website, and there is the dollars that you'll have to spend in order to take the exam. This series, as I said, I've kind of reordered the series a little bit so that we can do a much more sane, much more intelligent job of reviewing the different topics that make sense here. So when you look at Microsoft's website and you see the different percentages for each of the objective domains, you're not going to see them necessarily in the order that you see here. Because to me, in order to build an environment that incorporates all of these technologies, you kind of have to start first with just, building a forest or a domain and then configuring your trusts between domains and your sites and managing your replication. These things have to happen first, even though they're a little later on in the official objective domains, but they have to happen first for you to have a domain really to work with. So we will in this series start by configuring the domain that we end up using later on in the series. In fact, we will configure, because this is an advanced test or an advanced topic, we'll configure a couple of different domains. We'll do trusts between the domains. We'll do multiple sites here with multiple different subnets per sites. And we'll be using a lot of different IP addressing in order to accomplish that as well. And here in just a minute, I'm going to show you a tool that you can use to manage multiple different subnets within a VMware Workstation environment. With Active Directory up and running, then we're going to focus in on some of the more domain level type services like DHCP, DNS, and the new technology that is IPAM. These are important because, well, I got to have them for a lot of the other upcoming technologies to really function. These are not going to focus on the basic topics that you've already talked about in the 70-410 and 411 exam. You'll notice that I'm going to assume, or I have to assume, that you have some understanding of things like DHCP and things like DNS, because we'll be focusing only on the specific objectives and those objectives and how they relate to DHCP, DNS, and all the other topics here. So there'll be some skipping over, but again, this is under the assumption that you've already looked through the 410 and the 411 content and probably taken the exam. We'll talk about storage and file services. We'll do some clustering with NLB and failover clustering. We'll talk about moving of virtual machines if I have the Hyper-V role on top of my cluster. We'll talk about some really neat stuff here with site-level fault tolerance, like the Hyper-V replica solution that's out there. And I'll even dig into multi-site geographically dispersed clustering, which is an extremely complex topic. But hopefully I'll be able to distill it down for you so that you can understand how a geographically dispersed cluster may be useful for you in your environment. And then down here is where we get into some really awful topics. They're both awful and awesome at the same time, because these are, in some cases, really, really, really hard topics, really advanced level stuff. And when you are studying for this exam, I would highly recommend you just pay attention to what possible percentage these topics may be in relation to the entire exam, so you can focus your studying appropriately. We will be building an Active Directory certificate services infrastructure and actually dealing with certificates and certificate templates. This is something you gotta know these days, and it's really not that hard. We will also talk about dynamic access control, which is a nifty little, I guess, elevation to the way in which you can deploy rights and privileges to users based on more than just read, write, execute, and delete, and more than just their username or group name. But then we get into a couple of topics here that I'm going to show you just the stuff that's focused on for the exam. And I want to just caution you because, there are 20 topics here. Each one is about equally weighted. So just be aware of these when it comes time to focus your studying, because both of these are really complex topics that involve a lot of design work that go above and beyond the scope of what we're talking about here in configuring things. And then we finish off with a couple of easy ones for backup and recovery. So I think you're gonna appreciate kind of the way in which this is done as we get into the individual topics themselves. You'll see that I list up the objectives for each objective domain and try to go through and knock off each one of those as we go through each video in this series. Now, Microsoft has obviously a number of objectives here. For those objectives, they're kind of categorized in I like to think of it as an extremely unfair way, because normally with these percentage weightings on different objectives, you can use the percentage weighting as a mechanism to help you identify which topics are most important for you to focus your studying on. The problem is, as you can see, Microsoft, for each of the different objective, the categories here, has floated each of these categories in a way, or elevated each of these categories in a way that makes the percentage weighting almost useless as a mechanism to focus your study. Because of that, it is my recommendation that you focus on each of the individual objective domains as having equal weighting with the others. So in a 60-ish question exam, there are about 20-ish topics. So with 20 topics, 60 questions, maybe you get about 3 questions a piece for each one of these. So focus your studying appropriately, because odds are you're probably going to get somewhere plus minus of about 3 questions per topic if Microsoft actually follows their own stated percentage weightings for each of the topics here. Now, this is just kind of basic test-taking philosophy, basic test-taking strategy, but hopefully this will help you when it comes time to actually begin to prepare for these exams. Now, I told you that in order to do all the things that are required here in this somewhat ridiculous series of topics, we have to put together a bunch of virtual machines. And you don't necessarily need to follow my IP address structure here, but this is the addressing structure that I've put together for the machines that I'll be using to demonstrate the different technologies we'll be talking about. We will have one domain controller in a domain called specialized.net that I will use to show you how trusting works between two different forests. And then we'll have 4 different domain controllers here, and each domain controller being, well, these two domain controllers being in a site called Denver, this domain controller being in a site Las Vegas, and this one in a site called Phoenix, with different subnetting here to show you how you can set up sites and services inside of Active Directory. Now, if you've played with VMware Workstation before, you may recognize that setting up multiple subnet networking in VMware Workstation is not anything that's available right out of the box. I'm going to show you here in just a minute a tool that you can download, this cool little freeware router tool as a virtual machine that you can download and configure to enable the ability to route these different subnets around to each other. We will then later on use those subnets after we talk about them in the context of different sites. We'll then reuse some of these subnets so that we can show in using technologies like clustering, for example, how you would move traffic around through various different subnets or isolate traffic to various subnets based off of that traffic type. So we'll put storage traffic on one subnet and our cluster heartbeat traffic on another subnet. This ability to do this is a nice handy tool so you can just demonstrate on your own how to deal with multiple subnet routing and the different advanced topics associated with that. We'll have a file server that we will be working with pretty extensively, a pair of network load balancing servers, a 3-node cluster that will later on then augment with 2 additional nodes and an alternative site, an Active Directory certificate services, a certificate authority, CA server here, a server we'll be using with rights management services and ADFS. And then down here at the bottom, I've got a couple of additional virtual IP addresses that we'll be creating for a variety of the different activities we'll be working with. When we work with NLB, we'll be creating a virtual address for our NLB farm. We'll create a cluster virtual address, and then a virtual address here for a cluster application we'll be working with. A virtual machine, obviously, will need an address, and the replication broker that we'll use for Hyper-V Replica itself will also need an address. The long and short of it is you don't need to, you don't need to use my IP addressing, but I'm just putting these here to kind of give you a taste for the types of machines and things that we'll be creating here in this series. Now, before I get here to the conclusion, I want to just show you that I've got a lot of these resources up and running, and just want to kind of poke around with you with some of the tactics you can use for generating this whole environment on your own at home, so you can follow along. I totally recommend following along because that's the way in which you're going to really learn these technologies the best. So this is an example of a machine here, DEN DC1. This is the domain controller, one of the domain controllers, in fact the primary domain controller that we'll be using, well, the main domain controller that we'll be using throughout most of the series. This domain controller has DNS on it, and so you can see here as we start poking around through DNS, there's a whole lot of records that we're going to end up creating throughout this series. A whole lot of records in order to accomplish looking at all these technologies. So be prepared, because we're going to see pretty much a lot of this using not only what we're talking about here, but also some of the skills that you've learned back in 7410 and 7411. Now again, as I said before, VMware Workstation is just personally my hypervisor of choice for these kinds of activities. And so I'm working here with a copy of Workstation version 10. And when we're creating all these virtual machines over here, the one thing that you can find yourself running almost out of is really disk space. Because, I mean, there's a lot of virtual machines here to be created. And if you're trying to create individual VMs for each one, well, you can run out of disk space really quickly. I totally recommend grabbing yourself an SSD drive, maybe a half a T SSD drive or so, maybe a third of a T SSD drive, so that you can store these virtual machines, because running virtual machines on SSD is a much more palatable solution or experience than trying to run it on spinning drives. It's just awful slow if you don't use SSD. Now, one of the things that Workstation can do that's really cool is the use of templates and linked clones. This has the effect of dramatically reducing the amount of storage space that's required to accomplish everything that we're going to do in this series. Now, the way in which linked clones work in VMware Workstation, if you haven't used them before, starts out with creating a machine, a virtual machine. I built a Windows Server 2012 R2 Update 1 virtual machine. Put on that virtual machine all the updates, put on that virtual machine all the things that I knew I was going to need for any machine that I would get cloned off of that VM. Then I sysprepped the machine, So I went to the C Windows System 32 sysprep location and run the sysprep tool, shut the VM down, and converted it here to a template. Once you accomplish that, once you build the VM, sysprep it, and convert it to a template, well then after that you can use this template as a mechanism or as the basis for creating a bunch of linked clones. These linked clones here in VMware Workstation are awesome because, well, and I should mention too, you have to snapshot it also. So once you build the VM, sysprep it, shut it down, then snapshot it, and from that snapshot is the snapshot you can use for cloning. From there, you can end up creating one or really a whole lot of linked clones that don't take very long to build. In fact, they create extremely rapidly, and you end up dramatically reducing the amount of storage space that is required in order to get all these VMs up and running. Each VM in this environment runs, I think, on 2 gigs of RAM. There's nothing here that requires a whole lot of RAM, and we're not using them for any kind of heavy-duty workload, so you can conserve memory, RAM memory, but just keep them all at 2 gigs of RAM. The last thing I want to show you here is this technology called Vyatta, which is just a cool little router tool that I found that is a nice way to help you create a multiple subnet environment inside of a VMware Workstation environment. I told you that in this series we're going to be dealing with the 1net, the 2net, and the 3net. Now out of the box, VMware does not actually do any kind of routing. It has no intelligence in order to do that. But you can actually download, and you can use other tools if you like, but this is the one that I'm using. Download, for example, this either the virtualization ISO, or I think in my case I downloaded the live CD. Download the live CD, create yourself a virtual machine, and then once you've created yourself that virtual machine, well then plug it into the ISO file, you boot it, it installs the Vyatta solution, and then we can do a little bit of configuration on that Vyatta solution to actually build the VM that we need to build. This is what the solution looks like here. If I take a look at there is my Vyatta solution, and in fact, if I just drag this down here, you can see that this is a Linux-based solution. Right? This is a Linux-based tool that I can use for configuring this Vyatta router. Once I log into it, there's a couple of different steps that I can use. If I can bring up my little cheat sheet here, there's a couple of different steps that I can go through in order to get the router configured. I need to log in with the Vyatta as the username and password. I need to install the image and then accept the defaults. Power it down and then add in multiple VMware interfaces. You'll see here with this Vyatta router that I've actually have 3 different network adapters, 1, 2, and 3. Each of these we will then later tag for use in a different subnet. Once I've done that, I can power the virtual machine back on. It will recognize the fact that it now has multiple different network interface cards. And then from there, I can configure the router and then configure the router with this variety of different commands here. I will make this document available as a downloadable document on the CBC Nuggets website. So you can just grab a copy of this and just punch these in so that you can create your own infrastructure if you so choose. But this essentially sets the different ETH, the different network interface cards to the address 1.254, 2.254, and 3.254 with a 24-bit subnet mask here. Turns on the RIP protocol for each of the interfaces, sets the system address to 192.168.1.1, or excuse me, the system gateway address to 1.1. My subnet here, my main subnet is 192.168.1.0, which is why the gateway address is 1.1. And then I create for each of the 2 additional interfaces a NAT rule that says if I'm attempting to come to this location, well then send the traffic out through that ETH0, which is my 1net address, and turn on address translation, so masqueraded address translation. Do that for each of the 2net and the 3net, commit the changes and save them, and that completes the process of working with this router. Just punch these things in one line at a time and you'll see that the router will accept them. The last step in the process is involved with actually then telling your own router, the actual router that you're using in your home network, that it needs to then point to the Vyatta router anytime that a machine in your network is attempting to go to the 2net or the 3net. Now the way in which you can accomplish that comes back here. If I can bring up this web page here. My little consumer grade router that I have here in my office is an Asus RT56U router, something you buy right on Amazon. Really nice router, actually. This has some really nice features here, one of which is the ability to create static routes. I have created two static routes here for the 2net and the 3net that both point to the Viata router's address, 1.254. Created those with a metric of 1 and a 24-bit subnet mask with on the LAN side of the router. Applied the changes, and now all of my machines, whether they're on the 1net, 2net, or 3net, have the ability to talk to each other. This is just so that I can create network cards or multiple network cards for these machines, and then have those network cards be able to talk to each other. We're not doing any kind of crazy work here with network ACLs. We're not doing VLANs. We're just creating an open network space that spans the 1net, 2net, and 3net for the purposes of setting up these demos. So just wanted to make you aware of that because you're going to see that a little bit later on in this series. And you can actually build this at home, and it's kind of fun, honestly, to work with that router. It's really cool to be able to see how routing works if you're not experienced with how it works in some of the real big name routers that are out there today. So it is always a joy to be able to get to build these series for you. As I said, I've been doing this for a lot of years, and I've put together a whole lot of series here for CPT Nuggets by this point. This is yet another one of those that hopefully you and I will have an opportunity over the next 12 or 13 hours or so to really drill down into the specific objectives that are required for success in that important 70-412 exam. I want to wish you good luck and break a leg on taking that exam when you get to the other end of this series. I look forward to spending time with you throughout this series and helping you understand the advanced technologies in Windows Server 2012 R2 that are important for you and your Windows environment. My name is Greg Shields, and this is going to be a lot of fun. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.